He called her a servant's daughter before the queen taught him what blood could never teach: reverence. Rain fell over Blackwood Manor in silver sheets that evening, turning the long windows of the great hall into trembling mirrors while candles burned in tall golden branches above the gathered nobility. The air smelled of wet roses, polished oak, and old velvet warmed by firelight. Every guest had been placed according to rank, every chair measured by inheritance, every glance trained to notice who stood too near the center of power. Grace Miller knew this better than anyone. She was fair-skinned, 24, quietly dressed in a plain ivory gown with a dark blue ribbon at her throat, her brown hair pinned low beneath a modest comb, and a small silver brooch fastened near her collarbone. She had not meant to stand beside the table reserved for honored guests. Lady Catherine Ashford had brushed past her with a sweet apology and a firmer hand than sweetness required, guiding her just far enough into the wrong place that the room noticed before Grace could step back. Conversations thinned. Fans slowed. Lady Catherine's smile curved like moonlight on ice. "Miss Miller," she said lightly, "how bold of you. I did not realize the servants' families had been invited to stand among the royal guests tonight." Grace felt the words travel across the hall before she felt their sting. She had grown up behind thresholds, in corridors where important people passed without lowering their voices. She knew the sound of being dismissed. What she had not known was how loudly silence could gather around it. Duke Nathaniel Blackwood turned from the fireplace, tall and severe in black evening dress, his pale face cut in hard lines by candlelight. At 35, he carried his title like a shield and a sentence. He had been raised to believe that honor lived in names, estates, bloodlines, and rooms where the wrong person's presence could disturb the order of the world. His gray eyes settled on Grace. Not cruelly at first. Worse, coldly, as if she were a mistake in the arrangement of furniture. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice low enough to sound controlled and sharp enough to leave no doubt. "This section is reserved." Grace stepped back at once. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was directed here by mistake." Lady Catherine lowered her eyes with perfect innocence. "How unfortunate." Nathaniel looked from Catherine to Grace, and pride made its choice before conscience could speak. A servant's daughter should remember where she stands. The hall went utterly still. Even the rain seemed to pause against the glass. Grace's hand rose, not to cover her face, not to plead, but to touch the silver brooch at her throat. Beneath her fingers, the tiny white rose engraved on its surface felt strangely warm. Her mother, Mrs. Abigail Miller, had told her never to remove it, never sell it, never ask why a poor woman's child had been given something too finely made for poverty. Grace lifted her chin. Her cheeks were pale, but her voice did not tremble. "I know where I stand, Your Grace." Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. For one breath, he saw something in her he had not expected. Not shame, not panic, but the quiet sorrow of a woman accustomed to being placed beneath others and still refusing to become small. "Then see that you do not forget it," he said. A murmur passed through the guests, soft and satisfied, because society often mistakes a wound for entertainment when it is delivered by a powerful man. Lady Catherine turned slightly, hiding her smile behind her fan. Grace curtsied, not deeply, not submissively, but with a restraint so exact that it seemed almost royal. Then she walked away from the honored table, across the polished floor, past the chandeliers and the watching eyes, each step measured, each breath held with dignity. At the edge of the hall, she passed a tall mirror and saw herself for half a second. Ivory gown, blue ribbon, silver brooch, a woman everyone believed they understood. Behind her, Duke Nathaniel Blackwood returned to his place by the fire, yet the words he had spoken did not settle in him as triumph. They followed Grace instead, moving through the candlelit hall like a bell no one admitted hearing. Outside, the rain struck harder. Somewhere beyond the manor gates, delayed by the storm, Queen Eleanor's carriage was already on the road. Grace did not return to the servants' wing at once. To flee too quickly would have given the room the satisfaction of believing it had broken her. Instead, she walked through the west corridor with her spine straight and her fingers resting lightly over the silver brooch, as though the little white rose beneath her hand were the only steady thing left in the world. Behind her, music resumed in the great hall, polite and glittering, covering the memory of Duke Nathaniel's words with violins and crystal laughter. That was the way of noble houses. They buried discomfort beneath beauty and called the grave good manners. Only when Grace reached the narrow passage behind the east staircase did her breath finally shake. The corridor there was darker, lined with old stone and servant bells, a place where footsteps softened because no one important was expected to listen. Mrs. Abigail Miller stood waiting near the linen room, her gray hair tucked beneath a plain cap, her face pale with the knowledge that travels through houses faster than servants are permitted to speak. "Grace," she whispered. Grace tried to smile. It failed gently. "I forgot where I stood, apparently." Abigail closed the distance between them and took her hands. "Do not repeat their language as if it belongs to you." The words were soft, but urgent. Grace looked down at the older woman who had raised her with bread earned before dawn, stories told by candlelight, and a tenderness so careful it often felt like fear. "He said what everyone thinks." "No," Abigail said. "He said what he was taught to think." Rain shivered against a small corridor window high above them. Grace reached for the brooch again. Abigail's eyes followed the movement, and something like alarm crossed her face. "Did anyone touch it?" "No." "Did anyone ask about it?" "No." Lady Catherine looked at it. "Perhaps." His Grace did not. Abigail exhaled, but relief did not soften her. It only deepened the lines around her mouth. She led Grace into the small room they had been given behind the east wing, a modest chamber with a low bed, a washstand, 2 wooden chairs, and 1 narrow window facing the rain-dark herb garden. It was not a room for guests. It was not quite a room for servants either. Like Grace herself, it lived between names other people had chosen. Abigail lit a candle and closed the door. "Take off the brooch." Grace stilled. In all her life, Abigail had never asked that. "Why?" The older woman's fingers trembled as she reached for the clasp. "Because I must be certain." Grace stepped back. Certain of what? Abigail looked at her then, and the fear Grace had sensed since childhood finally stood uncovered between them. Of whether the past has found you. The room seemed to shrink around the candle flame. Slowly, Grace unfastened the silver brooch and placed it in Abigail's palm. The piece was small, no larger than a quarter, shaped like a white rose with 5 delicate petals, each etched so finely that even years of wear had not erased the work. Abigail pressed a hidden catch beneath the lowest petal. Grace had never known it was there. The brooch opened. Inside, under glass thinner than a fingernail, lay a tiny painted mark, a crown above a white rose, and beneath it, a single initial so faded it looked like a ghost. Grace stared. "What is that?" Abigail's eyes filled, but her voice stayed low. "A name too dangerous to remember." "Whose name?" "Not tonight. You cannot say that after what happened in the hall." Abigail closed the brooch quickly, as if the mark itself could hear them. "I can say it because what happened in the hall is exactly why I kept silent." Grace felt the old wound open in a new place. "You told me it was my mother's." "It was." The answer came too quickly, and with too much grief to be a lie. "But not the mother whose name I gave you." Grace stepped away until the back of her gown touched the washstand. For a moment, the rain, the music, the Duke's insult, and Lady Catherine's smile all seemed very far away. "Who am I?" she asked. Abigail held the brooch against her heart like a prayer that had become too heavy to carry. "You are the child I loved enough to hide." Grace's lips parted, but no sound came. The candle bent in a draft beneath the door. From the great hall came a distant swell of applause, bright and empty. Abigail crossed to her and took her face gently between work-worn hands. "Listen to me. Never remove this again. Never let Lady Catherine near it. And if Queen Eleanor arrives tonight, do not speak unless she speaks first." Grace went cold. "The Queen." Abigail nodded, and for the first time in 24 years, the woman who had raised her looked less like a mother protecting a daughter and more like a guardian standing before a sealed tomb. "That brooch is the reason you are alive." Nathaniel remained in the great hall long after Grace disappeared beyond the west corridor. The music had resumed, the guests had resumed, even Lady Catherine had resumed her place among the bright and poisonous flowers of society, yet something in him had not resumed at all. He stood beside the fireplace with one hand resting on the mantel, watching flames move over carved marble while his own words returned with an ugliness no applause could soften. A servant's daughter should remember where she stands. He had meant to defend order. That was what he told himself. Blackwood Manor had been chosen for Queen Eleanor's delayed reception because his family had served the crown for generations. Every placement in the hall mattered. Every guest list, every chair, every inch near the royal table was a declaration of rank. If boundaries blurred, insult followed. If insult reached the throne, the Blackwood name would answer for it. This was honor, he insisted. This was duty. But duty did not explain why Grace Miller's face would not leave him. She had not looked guilty. She had not looked ambitious. She had looked wounded in a way that asked for nothing, and that refusal to beg troubled him more than tears would have. Lady Catherine approached with 2 glasses of wine, offering one as if she were granting peace. "You handled it well," she said. Nathaniel did not take the glass. "Did I?" Her smile faltered for less than a second. Of course. The girl needed correction. It is kinder to remind people of their place before they embarrass themselves further. He looked at her then. Candlelight loved Catherine. It turned her blonde hair gold, softened her sharpness, made cruelty appear like wit. Many men had mistaken that talent for beauty. Nathaniel had almost been one of them. "She said she was directed there by mistake," he said. Catherine gave a small laugh. "And you believed her?" "I did not say that." "Good. Sentiment is dangerous in a man of your position." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Grace Miller has been permitted too much sympathy. A pretty manner, a quiet voice, and suddenly people forget she was raised under a servant's roof." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Her mother served in the palace, did she not?" "So I have heard." One of those women who confuse proximity to greatness with belonging to it. The sentence settled between them like dust over a coffin. Nathaniel turned back toward the hall. Across the room, a young maid bent to retrieve a fallen napkin, and an older countess shifted her chair without seeing her. The movement was small, ordinary, accepted. For the first time that evening, he noticed the cruelty hidden inside ordinary things. He disliked that Grace had made him notice. No, he corrected himself. Grace had done nothing. He had spoken. The discomfort was his own. "Where is Miss Miller now?" he asked. Catherine's fan paused. "Why should that matter?" "Because I asked." Her eyes cooled, though her smile remained. Likely returned to whatever corner she came from. Nathaniel turned on her fully. "You will not speak of her that way in my house." Catherine's lips parted, surprise breaking through polish. "Your Grace, I thought you agreed with me." He had. That was the shame of it. Or perhaps he had agreed with the part of himself that found it easier to punish a quiet girl than question a beautiful woman. Before he could answer, a footman entered and bowed near the doorway. "Your Grace, the road from the south gate has cleared enough for the royal carriage. Her Majesty is expected within the hour." The hall tightened with excitement. Guests shifted, servants moved, mirrors were checked, jewels adjusted. Pride rearranged itself for a higher audience. Nathaniel nodded and issued calm instructions, but his mind had gone back to Grace's hand at her throat, to the small silver brooch beneath her fingers, to the way she had said, "I know where I stand." Not defeated, not humbled, almost as if she knew the floor beneath her better than he did. When the footman left, Nathaniel crossed toward the west corridor before he had decided to move. Catherine's voice followed him, sweet with warning. "Surely you are not going after her." He stopped but did not turn. "I am going to make certain my guest has not been mistreated." "Guest?" Catherine repeated softly, as if the word itself offended her. Nathaniel looked back at last, his expression carved from shadow and firelight. "Until I decide otherwise, every person under my roof is my responsibility." He walked away before she could answer. Yet with every step toward the dim corridor where Grace had vanished, he felt the weight of a truth he was not ready to name. She had not forgotten where she stood. He had forgotten where honor did. Nathaniel found Grace in the narrow chamber behind the east wing, though he did not enter at once. The door stood partly open, and through the thin wedge of candlelight he saw Mrs. Abigail Miller holding Grace's hands as if the older woman feared the world might take her if she let go. He should have announced himself. A gentleman would have done so. But the sound of his own name and Abigail's frightened whisper held him still. "The Duke must not see the mark," she said. Grace's voice answered, low and strained. "What mark?" "The one inside the brooch. The white rose." Nathaniel's breath changed before he could stop it. The white rose was not a common ornament. It was the private emblem of Princess Rose, the Queen's younger sister, whose name had almost vanished from court conversation after her mysterious departure years ago. Nathaniel knew the symbol because Blackwood men were trained to remember royal histories, royal debts, royal griefs. He stepped back from the door, not from courtesy, but from shock. Before he could decide whether to knock, footsteps sounded behind him. Lady Catherine stood at the bend of the corridor, her ivory fan closed in one hand, her eyes bright with discovery. "How touching," she said softly. "His Grace visits the servants' passage now." Nathaniel's face hardened. "Return to the hall." "Gladly. But first you may wish to know that the Queen's embroidered handkerchief has vanished from the receiving table." The words were too smooth, too prepared. Nathaniel felt it instantly, though pride resisted naming it. Misplaced, perhaps. Catherine tilted her head. Perhaps. Or perhaps certain people grow bold when shown too much pity. The chamber door opened fully. Grace stood in the candlelight, the silver brooch fastened once more at her collar. She had heard enough. Abigail appeared behind her, pale as linen. Nathaniel saw the hurt in Grace's eyes when she looked at him, and it angered him because he knew he had taught her to expect accusation. Catherine lifted her voice just enough for two passing servants to hear. "Miss Miller, forgive me, but a royal item is missing. Since you were near the honored table earlier, perhaps you should allow your cloak to be checked." For clarity, Grace did not move. "You believe I took something from the Queen's table?" "I believe innocence should never fear clarity." Nathaniel looked at Catherine. "This is not the place." "Then let us return to the hall," she replied, "before Her Majesty arrives and asks why her property cannot be found." Grace's hand tightened over the brooch. Abigail whispered, "No," but Grace turned to her gently. "If I refuse, they will call refusal guilt." Nathaniel wanted to speak, to stop the procession before it became a spectacle, yet the habit of rank, proof, and public order delayed him by one fatal breath. That breath was all Catherine needed. Within minutes, Grace stood again in the great hall beneath chandeliers that made every face look sharper than it was. The music had ceased. Guests gathered in a widening half-circle. Catherine held up a folded white handkerchief embroidered with a royal crest, produced from the pocket of Grace's dark cloak by a maid too frightened to meet anyone's eyes. A murmur rose, hungry and elegant. Abigail covered her mouth. Grace looked at the handkerchief, then at Nathaniel. "I did not place that there." The hall waited for him. So did she. Nathaniel's voice, when it came, was controlled but not warm enough. "We will determine the truth." Grace's face changed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Confirmation. "Truth should not need permission from power," she said. Catherine smiled. Fine words for a girl caught with royal linen. Grace slowly removed her cloak and handed it to Abigail. Then she unfastened the pocket lining herself, turning it inside out before everyone. Nothing else fell. No jewels. No tokens. No hidden ambition. Only the handkerchief that had been made to accuse her. She lifted her chin. "I was born with little, Your Grace, but I was not born without honor." The word struck Nathaniel exactly where his earlier insult had begun to rot. Before he could answer, thunder rolled across the manor, and the great doors opened. Cold rain-scented air swept through the hall. The royal steward entered first, then two guards in formal blue, then Queen Eleanor herself in a dark silver cloak beaded with rain. Every guest bowed. Grace moved to do the same, but as she lowered her head, the clasp of the silver brooch slipped beneath her trembling fingers. It fell to the stone floor, opened on impact, and turned toward the Queen under the candlelight. The crown above the white rose gleamed from within. Queen Eleanor stopped so suddenly that the entire hall seemed to stop with her. Her face went pale. "Child," she whispered, with a sorrow no monarch could command away, "who gave you that brooch?" The question passed through the great hall like a candle flame moving over dry paper. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the rain beyond the open doors seemed to fall more softly, as if the storm itself had leaned closer to hear Grace answer the Queen. The silver brooch lay open on the stone floor between them, its hidden mark exposed beneath the chandeliers. A crown above a white rose, delicate as a secret and terrible as proof. Grace looked from the brooch to Mrs. Abigail Miller, whose face had gone ashen. For 24 years, Abigail had taught her to stand straight, speak gently, and never ask too much of a world that had already decided how little she deserved. Now the older woman looked as though every silence she had kept had arrived at once to judge her. "My mother gave it to me," Grace said quietly. The queen's eyes lifted to Abigail. Which mother? The words were not sharp, but they carried the weight of a throne and the grief of a woman afraid she already knew the answer. Abigail took one step forward, then another, until she stood beside Grace in the center of the hall. She did not kneel. Not yet. She looked at the queen with the exhausted courage of a servant who had spent a lifetime obeying one promise above all others. Your Majesty, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I was lady's maid to Princess Rose. A sound moved through the guests, half gasp, half disbelief. Lady Catherine's fan stopped midair. Nathaniel felt the name strike the room like a bell from a buried chapel. Princess Rose, the queen's younger sister, remembered in court portraits as pale, beautiful, and lost to history after a private illness no one discussed. Queen Eleanor's hand closed slowly around the edge of her cloak. Continue. Abigail bowed her head. The princess had a child. A daughter. The matter was hidden because factions at court would have used the child to divide the crown. The princess feared not scandal for herself, but danger for the baby. On the night before she was taken away from public life, she placed the child in my arms and gave me that brooch. Grace's breath caught. Daughter. Baby. Princess. The words did not feel like a crown descending. They felt like the floor vanishing. No. Grace whispered, not in denial of Abigail, but in protest against a life being rewritten while strangers watched. Abigail turned to her with tears in her eyes. I called you Miller so you could live. I let the world think you were my daughter because loving you as mine was the only way to keep you safe. Lady Catherine recovered enough to laugh softly, but the sound was too thin to deceive anyone. Surely this is desperation. A servant accused of theft invents royalty, and we are expected to bow. Queen Eleanor looked at her. The room froze beneath that gaze. You will be silent. Catherine's lips closed. Nathaniel had never heard the queen raise her voice. She did not need to. Eleanor stepped forward and bent to pick up the brooch herself before any attendant could move. She held it beneath the candlelight, turning it with trembling fingers. I gave this to Rose on her 17th birthday, she said. There is a flaw in the second petal, a tiny break in the silver. She said it made the rose look alive. Her voice thinned at the edges. No copy was ever made. Grace stared at the brooch in the queen's hand. The great hall, with its gold branches of candlelight and ranks of staring nobles, blurred around her. Nathaniel watched her sway slightly and took half a step forward before stopping himself. He had no right to be the one she leaned on, not after making her stand alone beneath suspicion. The queen came closer, slowly, as though approaching a memory that might vanish if startled. What is your name, child? Grace Miller, she answered, because it was the only name that had ever held her. Abigail's face crumpled. Grace Rose, she whispered. That was the name the princess gave you before I carried you away. The queen closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet but steady. She looked at Abigail, then at Grace, then at the handkerchief still lying on the table where Catherine's accusation had left it like a dead insect under glass. The matter of the handkerchief will be investigated, she said. But this child did not steal from my table. Catherine went pale. Your Majesty, you cannot know that. I know the difference between a thief and a woman standing in the shadow of a truth others feared. The words fell with quiet finality. Grace could not move. She felt every eye upon her, the same eyes that had watched her humiliation with polished hunger only moments before. Now they watched with uncertainty, and uncertainty was almost worse, because it proved their judgment had never been rooted in truth, only permission. Queen Eleanor held out the brooch. Grace did not take it at first. If what you say is true, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper, then everyone in this room has known where I stood except me. The queen's face tightened with pain. Yes. It was the first honest answer Grace had heard all night. Abigail began to lower herself then, not from fear, but apology. Grace caught her arm before she could kneel. Do not, she said softly. You were the only one who stood with me before any of this mattered. Abigail wept silently. Across the hall, Nathaniel lowered his gaze. He remembered his own sentence, cruel in its certainty, and felt shame take root deeper than pride could reach. Grace turned back to the queen, the silver brooch between them like a life returned too late to be simple. Outside, thunder faded into distant hills. Inside Blackwood Manor, no one dared speak, because the girl they had called lowborn was no longer standing where they had placed her. Queen Eleanor did not restore Grace's name with a proclamation. Not yet. A name hidden for 24 years could not be returned like a dropped glove before a room that had only moments earlier been eager to condemn her. Instead, the queen requested the small winter parlor, a quieter chamber beyond the great hall where the fire burned low and rain whispered against narrower windows. Grace walked there beside Abigail, not behind the queen, not before her, but in the strange middle place between a life she understood and one that had opened beneath her feet. Nathaniel followed at a respectful distance, his silence heavier than any apology he might have offered. Lady Catherine was made to remain in the hall under the watch of the queen's steward, her face composed but bloodless, while servants searched the receiving table, the cloakroom, and the path between them. Every polished guest in Blackwood Manor understood that the accusation had not ended. It had only changed direction. In the parlor, Queen Eleanor placed the silver brooch on a small table covered in dark green velvet. "There are things I must ask," she said, "and things I must answer for." Grace stood near the hearth, her hands folded tightly. Was my mother ashamed of me? The question came before she could soften it. Abigail made a wounded sound, but the queen answered first. "No, never." The certainty in her voice struck Grace more deeply than comfort would have. "Rose loved you before she was permitted to name you publicly. She was young, unprotected by anything except my promises, and I failed to understand how many enemies a child could have simply by being born near a crown." Grace looked at the brooch. "Then why was I sent away?" Queen Eleanor's gaze lowered. "Because the court was not a nursery. It was a room full of smiling knives, and your mother trusted one woman more than she trusted the throne." Abigail bowed her head. She placed Grace in my arms and said, "Let her be ordinary if ordinary will keep her breathing." The room went still. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. Ordinary. The word he had treated as evidence of lesser worth had once been a shield built by love. Grace turned to Abigail. "You should have told me." "Yes," Abigail whispered. "I should have. Every birthday, I promised myself I would. Then I would see you laughing over bread, or sewing by the window, or sleeping without fear, and I became a coward for one more year." Grace's expression trembled, but she did not look away. "You were my mother in every way I knew." Abigail covered her mouth. Queen Eleanor lifted the brooch and pressed the hidden catch again. Inside, beneath the crown and white rose, the faded initial R gleamed under candlelight. "Rose left letters," she said. "3 of them. One for me, one for Abigail, and one for her daughter when the danger passed. They are kept in the royal archive. If you come with me, you may read your mother's words yourself." Grace's breath caught. For a moment, she looked younger than 24, not like a woman being handed rank, but like a child hearing that love had been waiting somewhere in ink. Nathaniel took one step forward, then stopped. The restraint cost him. Grace noticed. That mattered less than he wished it did. A knock sounded at the parlor door. The queen's steward entered and bowed. "Your Majesty." The missing handkerchief was found in Lady Catherine Ashford's reticule, along with a duplicate thread spool matching the altered seam in Miss Miller's cloak pocket. Catherine's name seemed to darken the air. Queen Eleanor's face did not change. "Bring her." Nathaniel spoke then, his voice low. "Your Majesty, the fault began before the handkerchief. I gave Lady Catherine permission with my own contempt." Grace looked at him sharply. He did not look away. "I called you less than you were because I believed honor belonged to birth before conduct. I was wrong before I knew who you were. I was wrong when I thought you were only Grace Miller. Only." The word broke under its own shame. Grace's eyes cooled, not cruelly, but with truth. There was never anything only about Grace Miller. Nathaniel bowed his head. "No." The parlor door opened again, and Lady Catherine entered under the steward's watch, pale but upright, her pride clinging to her like wet silk. The queen looked at her, then at the brooch, then at Grace. "You attempted to disgrace an innocent woman before the crown." Catherine's lips parted. "I feared deception, Your Majesty." "No," the queen said. "You feared being outranked by someone you had already decided was beneath you." No voice rose. No violence shattered the room. Yet Catherine seemed to diminish beneath the calm force of being named correctly. Grace watched her without triumph. It surprised Nathaniel, though by then he should have known better. Grace did not need another woman ruined to feel restored. She needed the truth to stand without trembling. Queen Eleanor turned back to Grace, and before the Duke, Abigail, the steward, and the woman who had tried to shame her, the Queen lowered her head. Not deeply, not theatrically. Enough. Enough to make the world tilt. The crown owes you more than recognition, she said. It owes you apology. Grace stood frozen, the firelight bright on her pale face, the rain soft behind the glass, while Duke Nathaniel Blackwood watched the Queen bow before the woman he had told to remember her place. The Queen's bow did not lower her. It raised the truth so high that every person in the winter parlor had to look up at it. Grace stood before her, unable to move, while the silver brooch lay open on the green velvet table like a small door into a life she had never been allowed to enter. Abigail wept silently beside the hearth. Lady Catherine stared at the floor, her face pale with a humiliation she had tried to give another woman and found returned to her by justice itself. Nathaniel remained near the doorway, motionless, his black evening coat still immaculate, his title still intact, and yet something essential in him had been stripped bare. He had seen kings and generals receive honors. He had seen noblemen bow to rank, money, power, and fear. But he had never seen a monarch bow to a woman who owned nothing but a brooch, a hidden name, and a dignity the room had failed to recognize. Grace finally found her voice. "Please rise, Your Majesty." Queen Eleanor did, but her eyes stayed on Grace with a tenderness too wounded to be ceremonial. "I will not force a name upon you tonight," she said. "You have been forced into enough rooms by other people's choices." Grace looked toward Abigail. The older woman seemed smaller than before, not from guilt alone, but from the exhaustion of having carried a royal secret in servants' clothing for half a lifetime. Grace reached for her hand. "If I go with you," she said to the Queen, "she comes with me." Abigail shook her head at once. "No, child, I have no place in a palace." Grace's fingers tightened around hers. "Then neither do I." The words entered the parlor softly and remade it. Queen Eleanor bowed her head in acceptance. "Then she comes." Nathaniel felt the force of that answer more deeply than he expected. Grace had been offered rank, archive letters, a restored name, perhaps even a place at court. Her first condition had not been jewels, revenge, or recognition. It had been loyalty to the woman who had kept her alive when a crown could not. Honor, he realized, had been standing beside him in an ivory gown all evening, and he had insulted it because it arrived without title. The Queen turned to Lady Catherine. "You will leave Blackwood Manor at first light under my steward's supervision. Until the matter is formally recorded, you will not attend court, royal receptions, or any household under crown invitation." Catherine lifted her chin with desperate pride. "My family will object." "They may object in writing," the Queen said. "I will read it when conscience allows me leisure." No one smiled. It was not a room for amusement. It was a room for consequences. Catherine curtsied stiffly and was escorted out, the sound of her steps fading down the corridor like a song ending on the wrong note. When the door closed, silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had been delayed. Nathaniel stepped forward only one pace. "Miss Miller," he said. Grace turned to him. The name struck him as inadequate now, not because she might have another, but because he had used it when he wanted to make her small. "Grace," he corrected, the word low and careful. "I owe you more than apology." "Yes," she said. "No anger. No comfort. Only truth." He accepted it. "I spoke as though birth determined worth." Then I watched the Queen bow before the person I had failed to respect. "That shame is mine. I will not ask you to remove it for me." Grace studied him, and for the first time he understood how difficult it was to be seen clearly by someone he had wounded. "You are sorry because you know who my mother was," she said. "No." His answer came quickly, and this time quickness mattered. "I am sorry because I know who I was." Abigail looked away. Queen Eleanor watched in silence, allowing the exchange to belong to them. Grace picked up the brooch from the table and closed it gently. "Then become someone else without asking me to witness every step." Nathaniel's face tightened, but he bowed his head. "I will." Outside, the storm began to pass. Rain softened to a whisper. In the great hall beyond the parlor, the guests still waited, unsure whether they had witnessed scandal, miracle, or judgment. Queen Eleanor placed a dark silver cloak around Grace's shoulders with her own hands. The gesture was quiet, almost maternal, and it made the room ache. Grace did not look like a princess then. She looked like a woman who had been handed a door and did not yet know whether it opened to freedom or another kind of cage. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at Nathaniel. "You told me to remember where I stood," she said. "I will, but not because you placed me there." Then she left with the Queen and Abigail, carrying the white rose brooch against her heart, while Nathaniel remained behind in the fading firelight, learning that some words cannot be taken back, only answered by the life one chooses afterward. Grace left Blackwood Manor beneath a sky that had forgotten how to storm. The rain had thinned into silver mist, softening the gravel drive, the iron gates, and the long line of carriages waiting in humbled silence. Queen Eleanor's carriage stood nearest the steps, its dark lacquered sides shining with rain, its royal crest dim beneath droplets of water. No one spoke as Grace descended beside Abigail. The same guests who had watched her humiliation now lowered their eyes, not because they understood her, but because power had instructed them to be ashamed. Grace felt the difference. Respect born from revelation was not the same as respect born from character. One arrived late, wearing fine gloves and hoping not to be blamed. The other would have stood beside her when she was still only Grace Miller. Nathaniel stood at the top of the steps, several feet away, careful not to claim a farewell he had not earned. His face looked older in the gray light, less carved by pride than hollowed by it. "Grace," he said. She paused, but did not turn fully. "Your Grace." The title was polite. It was also a wall. He accepted it because he had built too many walls himself to complain when one stood before him. "The inquiry into Lady Catherine will be completed before morning," he said. "Every guest will receive a written account of her deception and your innocence." Grace looked at him then. "My innocence existed before your account." The sentence was gentle. That made it worse. Nathaniel bowed his head. "Yes." Queen Eleanor watched from beside the carriage, neither interfering nor softening the truth for him. Abigail held Grace's cloak closed at her throat as she had when Grace was a child, though now the cloak was the Queen's dark silver one and the brooch beneath it felt heavier than ever. Nathaniel took one step down, then stopped. "I was wrong when I called you what I did." "Yes." "I was wrong before the Queen arrived." "Yes." He drew a quiet breath. "And if you never allow me to say more than that, it will still remain true." For the first time, something in Grace's expression shifted, not toward forgiveness, but toward recognition of a man beginning to understand that apology was not a key. It was only the first knock on a door that might never open. "Do not become honorable because I may be royal," she said. "Become honorable because the next woman you misjudge may have no queen coming through the doors." Nathaniel's eyes lowered, and the words entered him with the force of a vow he had not been worthy to make. "I will remember." Grace almost smiled, but sorrow stopped it halfway. Memory is not enough. Then she entered the carriage with Abigail. Queen Eleanor followed and sat across from her, no crown on her head, no throne beneath her, only a woman holding the consequence of a family silence. As the carriage began to move, Grace looked once through the rain-marked window. Blackwood Manor receded behind her, all towers, candlelit windows, and old certainty. Nathaniel remained on the steps until the carriage reached the gate, a dark figure against the pale stone, no longer looking like a man who commanded the world, but like one who had finally been commanded by truth. The road to the royal residence took nearly 14 miles through wet fields and sleeping villages. Abigail sat beside Grace, twisting her handkerchief, while Queen Eleanor remained quiet long enough for the rhythm of the wheels to steady them all. At last, Grace spoke without looking up. "Did my mother suffer because of me?" The Queen's face tightened. "No. She suffered because those around her loved power more carefully than they loved her." Grace closed her hand around the silver brooch. "And what am I now?" Queen Eleanor leaned forward, not as a monarch, but as an aunt who had arrived 24 years late. "Tonight, you are tired. Tomorrow, you may be angry. After that, you may choose." The answer was the first gift Grace received from royalty that did not feel like a burden. She looked at Abigail, then out toward the rain-soft darkness. She had left as a servant's daughter, as a hidden niece, as a woman insulted and then honored too suddenly for either wound or reverence to feel real. Behind her waited a duke with shame in his hands. Before her waited letters from a mother she did not remember. For the first time in her life, The space between those two worlds belonged to her. 3 weeks passed before Grace returned to Blackwood Manor. By then, the rain had given way to a clear winter morning, and frost silvered the hedges along the long drive like lace laid over thorns. She came without the royal carriage, without ceremony, without jewels beyond the small silver brooch fastened at her throat. Abigail rode beside her, quiet and watchful, while a single palace attendant remained with the horses at the gate. Queen Eleanor had offered guards, titles, introductions, and every formal protection a crown could give, but Grace had asked first for her mother's letters. She had read them in a private room lined with blue silk and old grief. 3 letters written by Princess Rose in a hand that trembled only near the end. "My daughter," one began, "if ordinary life has saved you, then let no court make you ashamed of it." Grace had wept then, not for lost rank, but for the mother who had loved her enough to disappear from her story. During those same weeks, Nathaniel had not written to ask her back. That restraint became the first apology she nearly trusted. Instead, he sent formal accounts to every guest at the reception, naming Lady Catherine's deception, clearing Abigail's honor, and admitting his own failure before any mention of Grace's hidden blood. He dismissed 2 household officers who had allowed servants to be used in Catherine's scheme, restored Abigail's full dignity in writing, and requested that all future royal events at Blackwood Manor seat guests by invitation rather than inherited arrogance. Society was offended. The Queen was not. When Grace entered the manor again, the great hall looked different only because she did. The chandeliers were unlit in the pale morning. No music played. No crowd waited to measure her. Nathaniel stood alone near the fireplace where he had once spoken the sentence that changed both their lives. He wore a dark coat, simple for a duke, and when he saw her, he did not step forward until she had crossed the threshold by choice. "Grace," he said, "not Miss Miller, not Lady Grace, not whatever title court advisors had begun whispering around her. Just Grace." She stopped several feet away. "Your Grace." His face accepted the distance. "Lady Catherine has left the country for her aunt's estate. Her confession is recorded. Your mother Abigail's name has been cleared before the court." Abigail inhaled softly beside Grace. Nathaniel turned to her and bowed, deeply enough that the servants near the corridor saw it. "Mrs. Miller, Blackwood Manor failed you as well." Abigail's eyes filled, but she held her composure. "See that it fails fewer people, Your Grace." "I intend to." Grace looked at him then, really looked. The pride had not vanished from him. Pride rarely dies cleanly, but it had been humbled into something less cruel, something that no longer needed another person to stand lower in order to feel tall. "Why did you ask me to come?" she said. "I did not." He gestured toward the hall, the fireplace, the empty space where judgment had once gathered. "I asked whether you would permit me to say what should have been said here. You chose to come." That answer mattered. Grace hated that it did. Nathaniel lowered himself to one knee before her. The movement was quiet, without spectacle, without a single guest to admire it. "I do not bow because the Queen did," he said. "I bow because you stood with more honor when I insulted you than I had when I judged you. I bow because I mistook rank for nobility. I bow because true nobility is not proven by the height of one's birth, but by how low one is willing to bow before the truth." The hall held its breath. Grace did not reach for him. She did not forgive him because the image was beautiful. She had learned that beauty could conceal cruelty as easily as candlelight softened a blade. "Stand," she said. Nathaniel obeyed. "If I return to this house," she continued, "it will not be as a rescued secret, or as proof of your humility, or as a woman grateful to be seen after power made it convenient. No," he said, "it would be as yourself, or not at all." Grace touched the brooch at her throat. Beneath her fingers, the white rose was cool and steady. "Then begin by remembering this. I was Grace Miller before I was anyone's lost blood. That name is not beneath me." Nathaniel bowed his head. It never was. Sunlight crossed the floor between them, pale and patient. No vow was made that morning. No easy ending dressed pain as destiny. But when Grace turned toward the doors, she did not leave at once. She asked to see the library where her mother's name had once been erased from court histories, and Nathaniel walked beside her, not leading, not following, leaving space enough for choice. Some hearts are not restored by crowns, apologies, or bowed heads. They are restored when truth is finally given room to stand.